Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale American M4A3 105 HVSS Sherman tank. Now, unlike many of the other smaller scale builds which are found on the ECA channel, in which those builds are built for private commission and belong to a private collector, this model that you see here is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these videos, I often take on commission build projects from scales ranging between 1/35th scale all the way up to 1/6 scale. As for availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. Now, this model here is built predominantly out of the box, however, it does feature several mods and alterations that were made to the stock kit to bring it up to the specs that you see here. We'll be going over all these additions and modifications in this video. Before I continue with the video, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around the model. This vehicle here is the M4A3 105 HVSS Sherman tank. The 105mm equipped Sherman tanks are an interesting subcategory of the Sherman tank family tree. These vehicles here were intended as an infantry support vehicle and were used for assaulting purposes. The 105mm howitzer was lower velocity compared to that of the other guns which were used on the Sherman, namely that of the 75 as well as the 76. However, the 105mm payload was excellent for its high explosive capabilities. Another interesting point about the 105mm Sherman is its actual classification. It's not really classified as a tank, however it's also not referred to as an artillery piece or a vehicle like a gun mortar carriage or a self-propelled gun. Unlike other type of vehicles which had similar type of capabilities like the M7 Priest or even the M40, the 105mm Sherman retained all of the armor protection of the Sherman as well as also all of the standard Sherman's secondary armament. This would include a bow-mounted M1919A4 machine gun as well as a secondary M1919A4 which was located inside of the coax spot on the mantlet. With this added armor protection, the vehicle can keep up with the infantry as well as with the other tanks and be called upon when necessary. The vehicle can engage in direct fire as well as indirect fire capabilities as well. Unlike the other variants of the Sherman, which were manufactured by a multitude of different manufacturers in both the United States as well as even in Canada, the M4 105 is the exception. All of the M4 and M4A3 105 production was conducted by Chrysler Corporation. These vehicles were a relative latecomer to the war. Production started in February of 1944 of the M4 105 variant. The last of the M4A3 105 variants ended in June of 1945. However, even though they weren't in production for relatively a long period of time, approximately 4,680 units of the different type of 105 variants were produced by the end of the production run. So the vehicles were actually very prolific in that regard. Now, when it comes to the 105 Shermans, there are really two main variants. You have the M4 105 and then the later M4A3 105. The difference between the two variants is that of the hulls. The M4 105 utilized the power pack of the M4 Sherman, which was that of the radial engine made by Continental. The later M4A3 version of the 105 utilized the power pack of the Ford GAA V8. Now, the M4 105 is the only Sherman variant that utilizes the Continental radial engine with that of the later pattern of hull. The M4 105 never utilized the hull of the earlier pattern of Shermans, the versions typically found with a 3-piece transmission cover, as well as the blistered front glacis plate hull. These vehicles are easily identified in that having the characteristics of a later pattern Sherman hull. However, they feature the engine deck and rear hull layout of the earlier pattern of M4. When the M4A3 made it into production and started being fielded, this was the pattern of Sherman that the US military really decided to focus all of their other equipment around. This includes upgrading many of the other vehicles to A3 status with the use of the Ford GAA. The M4-105 was no different, and this was when production switched over to the M4A3 105. This vehicle here simply utilizes the standard lower hull from the M4A3. The two 105mm Sherman variants both utilized the VVSS and HVSS suspension systems. As for the tank's turrets, both the M4-105 and the M4A3-105 utilized a high bustle later pattern of Sherman turret. This turret here was basically the same as the one for the 75mm Sherman. However, the big difference is that of the second ventilator. Due to the more greater amount of fumes which are emitted by the 105mm howitzer, the Sherman's design with the single air blower mounted in the turret was not going to be sufficient. So a second blower was added and is found on top of the rear bustle. Because of the blower, this has to reconfigure that of the turret's roof. Now, the original Sherman 105s did feature a split hatch cupola, but with the later switch to the single hatch cupola, the design required a special Shorty 50 caliber Pintle mount in order to be able to mount the anti-aircraft gun on top of the turret's roof and have it not get in the way of the secondary blower. Now, even though this vehicle's use in World War II was very limited, the vehicle did see a lot of action post-World War II with the US military in Korea, as well as these vehicles were widely issued out to Allied nations and were used throughout many years during the Cold War. Now that the walk-around's out of the way, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the models first started in order to get a good idea on what the base starter kit was like. And here's the model just before the start of the project. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this 1/35th scale M4A3 105 HVSS Sherman tank kit from Dragon. The kit number for this particular model here is Dragon Kit 6354. The kits themselves are about 10 years old now. The kits were originally released in 2006. However, the tooling on these models are pretty much up to date in terms for the other offerings made by DML. This particular model here I acquired from a model show back in 2009 and has been sitting in the stash ever since. And as you can see, has been stored in a very, very, very dusty portion of the shop, as it's so hard to make out the box art from the dust. These models were pretty prolific at the time, and even though they were originally released back in 2006, are fairly prolific and still can be found today, as I believe they've been in production for a little while. The kits retail anywhere from $30 to about $60 US and can be found on the online resources such as eBay, possibly Amazon, and you might be able to snag one of these in a local hobby shop or two. Like I mentioned before, this model here I acquired from a model show vendor. I actually went to the show with my 1/6 scale T28 Super Heavy tank, and when I was at the show, when I was at the vendor's kiosk, the fellow recognized me from my model that was posted on the other armor modeling forums at the time. We struck up a quick little conversation, and before the show was over, the fellow offered me this kit here, new in box, with the discounted price of about 30% off, of which I couldn't refuse, and so the model sat in my collection and was waiting for me to get to it. In addition to that, this model here was also opened up from time to time, as it was used to help me scale up my 1/6 scale M4 105mm conversion set, which is found on the EastCoastArmory.com product line. In addition to being used to scale up that kit, I also went ahead and borrowed some runners from this kit here that is found on my Dragon 1/6 scale build series, in which I showcase how the 1/6 scale Dragon kit shares a lot of commonalities with this particular kit here, with the way the runners and details are laid out, as really that kit is nothing more than a scaled up version of the base model kit that we have in this box. So if anyone is a frequent viewer of the channel, you are going to recognize a few of these pieces. As for the kit itself, it is an all-plastic model kit. However, it does feature some nice little additions, including that of an aluminum barrel, as well as a fret of photo etch. This model here is a huge improvement over Dragon's original foray into the 105mm equipped HVSS Sherman tanks, in which that model was originally released back in the late 1990s and actually had the flamethrower attachment to it. That model was heavily based off of the original Dragon tooling, which was also borrowed from the Auxilary kits. More information on those are discussed in the vintage Dragon M4A3 E8 videos that I do have on the channel as well. After the 90s came and went, Dragon went ahead and had capital to redesign many of their older re-released kits. The Sherman series was one of them. Rather than relying on the older pattern tooling of the Auxilary kits, Dragon went ahead and started fresh with the tooling and started to tooling up their own components. And that is found in this kit here, as well as many of the other Sherman tank kits, which were released by Dragon in around the mid-2000s era. As for the box itself, if we could see through the caked on layer of dust, we have here the main, there we go, get some of this crap off. We have here the Sherman tank as in the forefront. In the back we have another Sherman variant, looks to be that of a composited hull M4 with a paint pattern of red-brown over olive drab. The main vehicle is just all olive drab and does not appear to have, actually no, it does appear to have a pattern found on the barrel as well as the top portion, which is seen on the color plate that we have here. The box art is made by another artist who I'm not really sure of. It's not your typical Dragon work, which is typically either done by Ronald Volstead or Vince. As for the rest of the graphic design, it's your typical 35 to 45 series, or 39 to 45 series. It shows a lot of the CAD drawings on the back and on the sides. And it goes into detail on many of the features that are found with this kit. Cracking open the box will reveal the kit contents. First runner we have here is that of the turret. It's that of a standard high bustle 75mm turret, which of course with the addition of a few of the parts are going to make it into that of the 105. In fact, here we have the 105mm components with that of the barrel, the rotor drum, and the mantlet. Mantlet does have some nice cast texturing, and the rotor does have nice rendered fastener detailing. The barrel apparently is slide molded and does have some rifling detail which is molded in, which is a nice touch. What's nice about the barrel is that it is a solid piece and it's not a two-piece affair, so you don't have to worry about that of a seam when gluing them together. Many of the components on the turret itself will not be utilized on this build, as these are basic generic Sherman turret components, where you have the difference between the early and late pattern Commander's Cupolas. Digging into the box, next runner takes us to an entire T23 76mm turret. This here is the earlier pattern, and this kit here looks to be from the Red Army M4A2 76, which came out again in the early portion of the 2000s. The turret is nicely detailed, nice cast texturing as well as casted in numbers. However, is not going to be used on this build, as I believe the only parts that are going to be used on this build here is that of the Deflector Grille that we have here in the back. And for anyone who has built the 1/6 scale version, you will see almost the exact same layout of these parts. Now, it's important to point out that they are technically inaccurate for a Sherman, and on the 1/6 scale build, I go into great detail on how to correct it. However, for this 1/35 scale model, it's not really as important in my opinion. Digging deeper into the box takes us to the lower hull portion. This is important to point out that this is a late pattern hull. It has the HVSS mounting components already molded on, which is a nice feature. And you can also see on the sides where they meet the lower pan, we have sections cut out. This is a feature that is exclusively found on very late pattern M4A3 hulls, and from what I've seen, typically it is the vehicles that came out of the factory as a M4A3 E8 configuration had these type of cutouts found on them. The earlier versions with the HVSS suspension just had straight 90-degree cuts to these panels. Moving on from there takes us to the HVSS suspension. Now, these runners here are the same exact runners which were then later reused and recycled for the Dragon American T28 Super Heavy Tank kit, which was also built and has a model showcase video on the ECA channel. Needless to say, the pieces are very nicely done in that the tires and the hubs are actually two separate pieces, which makes painting and weathering a lot more interesting compared to just having the pieces all mold together like on traditional model kits. The HVSS suspension is nicely rendered with that of the swing arms, and they do have separate shock absorber pieces supplied. Same could also be said with the running gear for the sprockets. You notice we have two options, the solid and the spoke. Digging deeper takes us to the upper hull runner. And on this runner here, we have several options to convert the tank from an M4A3 to an M4A2 late with the later pattern of front hull. This is the M4A2 engine deck and underpiece. And here goes the M4A3 rear hull as opposed to the M4A2 version. Of course, this tank being built as an M4A3, there's going to be an excessive amount of spare parts that are not going to be utilized and will be heading into the spare parts bin. This is a common trait found on Dragon kits, and it is interesting to see just how many plastic is wasted on parts that simply just don't get used. But that's why they come in handy for the spare parts bin and are used in rainy day projects. So it's good to have. Here we have the M4A3 specific components. What's also interesting is that they gave you yet a secondary rear panel, which looks to be identical to the other version found on the other runner. As for why they did this, again, I don't work for Dragon, so I can't really say for certain. However, we have here the engine hatch with separate grills, which is interesting because on the 1/6 scale one, they kind of followed this format, but they went ahead and integrally molded these pieces onto the engine deck and need to be amputated, but again, that's in another video and definitely one I recommend watching for someone who's building that kit. Back to this one here, finally getting down to the bottom portion of the box. The last of the plastic parts is that of the guide horns for that of the HVSS rubber tracks. Now, what's interesting is that this tank does have the single-piece vinyl style tracks, which in my opinion is awesome. I hate individual track links, and these do have some nice detailing for the medium represented, very similar to the Dragon T28. And just like with that kit, the tracks are just the surface detailing, and for the tooth, they're actually separate plastic pieces that got to get glued to the rubber tracks. With this type of setup, it kind of gives you the best of both worlds. You do get the simplicity of working with the single-piece vinyl track, and you do get the better, greater detailing of the HVSS Sherman tracks with the tooth, with the hollowed-out guide horns, which is something that is typically found on either individual track links or workable track links. So you kind of get the best of both worlds in this situation. And moving on from the tracks, you can see here a fret of clear plastic parts, of course, for periscopes as well as headlights and taillights. A bag of road wheels. Like I said, they're separate from the road wheel hubs, as well as the idler wheels as well. We also have here a decal sheet with the markings to build the tank in a few different forms, which is mentioned on the side of the box, as well as some photo etching for that of the HVSS components. Now this is actually a nice feature and is one that was also used, I believe, on their M51 Super Sherman kit as well, which was part of, I believe, their premium edition line, but that's a topic for another day. Finally, on the bottom of the box, we have here a set of metal upgrade parts. We have here an all CNC'd aluminum barrel, which is interesting that they gave you this because the kit's plastic barrel is actually very nicely done, and unlike the metal barrel, has the rifling already molded in. The metal barrel, that's not the case. So it's basically up to the builder on which way he wants to go. The CNC barrel is technically better in that it's a CNC tube. The plastic barrel does have some better surface detailing towards the muzzle end, and it's not exactly a seam that needs to be removed as the piece is molded one piece. But again, it just gives the builder more options and more pieces to work with his build. You also have here these pre-cut brass tubes. This is for the tank's suspension system, in which there are the shock absorbers mounted on top of the bogies, and you also have some springs, as the kit claims to have a working suspension. However, this is of dubious value, as I could definitively say from their T28 American Super Heavy Tank build, in which it had a similar type system, these springs here are completely inept in being able to get everything to function, and also the frail and small size of the parts really makes the pieces trying to function very difficult, if not almost utterly impossible. So more than likely, since the tank is static, I'm just going to forego the springs and just build the suspension in a static form, but I'll be going over more about that in the completed portion here of the video. Digging further in the box, takes us to the instruction sheet. As you can see, a lot of parts are going to be joining the spare parts bin. As for instructions themselves, it's standard Dragon with the CAD, and so far from what I've seen here from thumbing through it very briefly, it looks to be pretty straightforward. However, but like I always say on these builds, sometimes there are mistakes found on these Dragon instructions. If so, I'll definitely be mentioning it in the later portions of the video. And there's also an extra decal sheet in here. However, this here is from another project or another kit, and it looks like it just fell in the box throughout the years of this thing clunking around the shop. Starting with the model's running gear, the running gear and suspension components that you see on this build here are all stock for the Dragon kit. Now, as for the HVSS themselves, what was mentioned in the unboxing portion was that this kit here was designed to have a functional suspension system. This was facilitated with that of metal coil springs, which would be concealed inside of the volute spring tubes that we have on the HVSS. Unfortunately, just like I predicted in the unboxing portion, I was unable to get the units to function properly. Once the coats of paint and everything starts getting assembled, having the suspension pieces be functional becomes very problematic, and the pieces are just not designed for that type of robustness. So rather than trying to make the pieces function, I went ahead and simply made them static in the static state that you see here. Moving towards the idler wheel, the rear idlers found on this kit here are designed by the Dragon in order to be adjustable in very similar way as it is on the real Sherman tank. Now, when it came time for mounting on the tracks, even with the idler wheels in the most tight configuration that they could be set at, the tracks were on this particular kit here were still very loose. In order to get the tracks to the proper tension, I went ahead and had to amputate a link off of each of the vinyl tracks. This was very easily done with a very sharp and fresh X-Acto blade. Once the links were carefully removed, the track was then reassembled, and the tension is at a much more appropriate level. This, of course, was done to both sides of the tank. While on the running gear, one common bit of detailing that I often mention in these videos, and is actually one that I commonly see overlooked by many model builders, has to do with that of the Zerk fittings. With the Sherman with the HVSS suspension, the Zerk fitting details are found integrally molded into these components on pretty much all of these smaller scale 1/35 scale models that are on the market. To really make them shine, the builder really doesn't have much work to do with the exception of adding a little drop of red paint. As for where the red paint goes, on the road wheels that are found on the main HVSS bogies, they are found right here on the portion of the hubcap. On the larger return roller, it is also found on the hub. And for the smaller return roller, it would be in the center portion of the hubcap. A simple brush of red paint is all that's needed to really make this shine and pop compared to leaving it oversprayed with the base. Moving to the tank's tracks, the tracks on the model here are the stock original units, and like I said in the unboxing portion, are very nicely done for the medium. Now, as for painting them, the tracks themselves are painted with two different type of colors. This is because on the real Sherman tank, this version of the track is the steel chevron HVSS pattern of track. To paint this, the outside portion of the real track is actually made from metal, while the inner portion where the wheels roll on would actually be rubber. On the model here, I painted the track itself with that of a very dark gray, while the rubber portions were painted with flat black. This two-tone gives more of a contrast between the two mediums, and it prevents everything from glazing together and looking the same. As for the weathering, the tracks on the metal portion have their scratched metal surfaces exposed, while on the rubber portions, they have their rubber wear type weathering, which is a different type of color and again helps with the contrast. Moving our way to the back portion of the model takes us to the Deflector Grille. Now, this is one portion on this smaller 1/35 scale Dragon kit, which does have some inaccuracies to it. Now, on the real Sherman tank, it's important to point out that this grille here can actually fold up into this cavity here on the inside portion of the upper hull. This is so the crew can get access to that of the engine hatch, which is located just behind the grille work. On the Dragon kit, the way they went ahead and designed everything, you are missing several of these features, namely that of the hollow cavity, as well as a few other smaller fittings that are found on these tanks. However, for this 1/35 scale model, it wasn't really a problem, so I was able to build everything pretty much out of box without having to tamper and modify anything in this section here. As a side note, if anyone does really want to have an accurate rendition of an A3 in order to fold up the grille, a better choice than the Dragon kit here would be the kit from Tasca, as those kits do have the appropriate detailing for that type of detailing. As for the Dragon kit here, like I said, everything was basically built out of box. One mod that I did make to the grille, which was absent, is that of this small little hook that we have here. Like I said before, the grille can fold and tuck away into this section, and to do that, there is a small little latch found on the inside, and this little lever here would lock into that latch, thus holding the grille up in its folded state and preventing it from falling onto and dinging the mechanic's head. If anyone wants to know how the system works, I go into more detail about that in my 1/6 scale M4A3 builds that I've done throughout the years. With the tank on the mirror, you can see what the under detail looks like for that of the hull. We have here the two exhaust manifolds, the engine hatch, as well as the tow hitch. All these components were simply built out of box with no mods being necessary. The one mod that I did make, though, was that to the engine hatch. The engine hatch does have a small little handle, which is found on the real unit. This handle is a molded-in nub found on the Dragon kit, and for the model here, the molded nub was deleted, and a new handle was made from a bent piece of wire and added in place. This is also going to be mentioned quite frequently with the other grab handles found on the rest of the tank, as a similar procedure was done to them as well. Moving our way up from the deflector takes us to first the auxiliary generator exhaust. The Sherman tank utilized a small little gas generator found on the inside portion of the hull, which was known as the Little Joe. The Little Joe was located in this portion here of the tank's hull. In fact, that's what this gas cap on this portion here is intended to be used to refuel. Now, on the M4A3 variation of the Sherman, the Little Joe exhaust emerged out from the bottom portion of the sponson, ran along the side of the sponson, and then emerged from this little section over here. Now, the Dragon kit does supply you with the exhaust detailing, and is nicely done and rendered. One area to watch out for is to properly weather this component, as this is another little bit of detailing that is commonly overlooked by most builders. Moving from the Little Joe takes us to the rear fender mounts that we have on each side. Now, the rear fender mounts are absent on the kit, and the versions that you see here are fabricated out of small little lengths of Plastruct stock. Now, the fender mounts on the HVSS Sherman are a little bit different compared to the ones found on the VVSS. The HVSS versions feature a shorter length of material and only have 2 holes present for mounting of the fender, as opposed to the 3 holes and slightly longer versions found on the VVSS units. The reason for this is because of the mud flaps, which are utilized on the HVSS versions, are actually longer, and the 3rd hole, which would be used for mounting on the fender, on some units would have been found on this portion here of the extended fender. The extended fender would have a small section that would bend down, and the hole would be present on that unit in order to bolt on the fender. This was not the case, though, with several of the other versions I've seen on other Shermans in real life. However, the other bracket portion, though, was definitely a constant. If you notice, if anyone is trying to add this detailing, the piece does not go all the way to the edge of the hull. And the reason for this has to do, again, with the Little Joe. The fenders need a small little area for the Little Joe to emerge, and even though the Little Joe is only found on one side, it is a mirror image on both sides in regards to the actual fender flap mount. Moving our way to the front of the model takes us to the nose and to the lower hull shackle points. These are kit supplied, and on this kit here were separately molded from the transmission cover, which is a nice feature. The pieces were drilled out with that of a small little Dremel bit, and a similar procedure was also done to the rear shackle mounts, which are located on the lower portion of the rear hull. This does greatly help the accuracy of the model and improves it from leaving it simply as molded flat. Moving up to the transmission cover itself, you'll notice that the transmission cover does have some cast texturing added. This was not part of the kit and was added by myself. The reason for adding the cast texturing was, first, the stock cast texturing was not really well pronounced, and after a couple layers of paint, the piece would look completely smooth. So the rougher texture was needed in that regard. Also, the cast texturing was done in order to flare in the top bolt strip with that of the rest of the transmission cover. This is a common feature that needs to be done to most Sherman kits on the market. Another reason why the Fender Supports needed to have been deleted and replaced had to do with the fitting of the transmission cover to that of this side of the hull. Now, the way the kit is designed, the transmission side portions are actually integrally molded into the lower hull of the Sherman. On the real tank, the transmission was a single encompassing unit that would then bolt onto the tank via a row of fasteners on the sides and the bottom, of course, along the top. Now, if you follow the kit's instructions and build the kit with the kit supplied parts, you will have about a 1/16 of an inch of material that overhangs on the transmission on either direction, on both sides. This has a couple problems. First, it's not very accurate in its appearance, in that the transmission cover, like I said before, was one smooth and continuous casting, and there was no overhang. And the other problem has to do with the fenders. Because of the overhang, these Fender Supports, which are molded into the transmission cover, will not line up properly when it comes time to actually install the fenders for themselves. Because of this, the Fender Supports need to have been deleted. And you can see from the pictures on the side what I was referring to with the overhang. The overhang was not too difficult to remove. I used that of a Dremel with some sandpaper, and the whole thing just polished away. But as you can see, by doing this modification, the molded in sections on top needed to have been deleted, and of course replaced with that of strips of aluminum and brass, which in the end are a lot better compared to the molded in versions found on the kit. If anyone's trying to build this kit and run into this and simply just try to mount the fenders onto the kit supply component, you're going to have a lot of difficulties with trying to get everything to align properly. While on the front mud flap, this takes us directly to the tin work and the extended fenders, which is a hallmark found on any Sherman with an HVSS suspension. Now, on this particular kit here, Dragon went ahead and did something very unique in having these pieces not as plastic sections that get glued on, or even pieces that are molded into the upper hull, which is typically done on most other manufacturers of Sherman tank kits. Instead, what Dragon went ahead and did was they supplied you these pieces with that of thin brass photo etch, which in many ways is very true to the real form. However, with this type of media, the model's difficulty also goes up very much. The photo etch used for these pieces here, like I said, is very thin brass, and to properly bend them to the correct shape is something that is best done with that of a photo etch bending machine. The machine is basically like a miniature box and pan brake, and it allows you to get nice, long, straight crimped pieces bent into the photo etch. For this procedure here, it's absolutely required. Otherwise, bending these fenders with a traditional needle nose plier or some kind of a metal square is going to be very, very difficult. Once the pieces are all bent, they simply get mounted to the hull in basically the same fashion it is on the real tank, and they install very easily and really pretty effortlessly. As for the front fenders, the fenders are flat, which of course you have to bend and tweak to shape. Now, the side portion here of the fender needs to be connected to that of the top. Now, even though it is integrally one piece, when everything gets bent together, you're going to have to fight the springiness of the metal in order to get everything locked down. Now, in most cases, most people may use a drop of super glue in order to facilitate this. However, on this model here, rather than using super glue, I went ahead and actually soldered the components together. The soldering, of course, is the best way to secure these two pieces together, as it is a permanent bond and basically will last forever. However, the soldering is another technique that is best led for someone who has a lot of experience with working with sheet metal work. As for the Fender supports, the supports you see here are the kit Dragon ones and are very nicely detailed and do assemble fairly easily. However, one thing to keep in mind is that these pieces are actually very frail and are easily damaged upon removal from the sprue. In fact, while doing this model here, I actually accidentally broke one or two of them when I was trying to extract a piece due to that of a dull X-Acto blade. Fortunately, due to my T28 Super Heavy Tank project that was also a Dragon kit, I had a spare runner which contained these exact same pieces on them, so I had on hand several replacements that was able to do the job. However, if anyone's working on one of these kits or any of the other kits which utilize the same parts, keep in mind you really need to change your X-Acto blade when it comes time to working on these fittings. Moving back to the front plate of the model takes us to the headlights and the brush guards. All these components are again stock Dragon. Now, one thing that I like about this model here is that the headlights, the taillights, as well as the periscopes are molded in clear plastic. This is something that has been seen on a few of the other Dragon kits before. Now, when it comes time for painting, because these pieces are made in clear, I like to paint the pieces with silver or red paint just prior to the installation and painting of the model. Now, this of course is done to the back portions of the light. The reason for this is that after the tank gets painted and weathered, once all the paint work is done, with a small little paintbrush and some solvent, I brush it onto the areas of the lenses. Once the paint is removed from the lenses, this gives you the clear plastic lens with that of the dull silver color that is found on the back portion. This, of course, makes the headlight look a lot more realistic as you have that dull silvery look behind the glass. Now, as for the horn, the siren, for whatever reason, is also found integrally molded into the clear portion of the runner. For the model here, I went ahead, obviously you don't have to remove any paint off of that. However, one mod that was made to the siren was that the siren's face is actually totally flat. And on the real tank, it's actually that of a funnel. To improve the model's accuracy with a Dremel bit, I simply go ahead and I bore out the center portion of the plastic, giving you that of the hollow appearance. As for the brush guards, this is one section where you actually have some options. The kit does supply you on the plastic runner conventional plastic brush guards. However, also included are that of photo etch brush guards. For this model here, I went ahead and utilized the photo etch brush guards for all of the headlight and taillight detailing. Now, this does add complexity to the model, as well as it does make it a little bit frail, and you have to be careful when handling. The main headlight brush guards are not too bad. However, the siren brush guard is a little bit more complex, with having to put that little cross member into the piece. Just like on the fenders, the cross section is actually directly soldered to the brush guard, making it very strong, or as strong as it can be for that matter. Now, as for the headlights, just like on all my Sherman builds, they've received a little canister found on either end of the brush guard. This is made from a small little length of shrink tubing, and like I've mentioned, their purpose many times is for that of a plug, which is to be used on the headlight when the headlight is not fitted to the tank. Moving from the headlights takes us to the bow M1919. The 1919 is the kit original, and the only mod that I did was to drill out the muzzle end of the machine gun, as it was molded solid, as is commonly found on most kits. Of course, this is only done by someone that has the correct amount of tooling to do this, as this is an easy portion to screw up if you're using the wrong tools, or if you're using the tools in a wrong way. Moving on from the 1919 takes us to the tank's side hull mounted first aid kit. Now, the first aid kit is one of those components which is found on tanks at the very end portion of the war. Because this tank here is being built to represent a vehicle from late March or early April 1945, this bit of detailing here would be present on a vehicle of this period. As for the detailing itself, this was supplied by the Dragon kit and was very nicely done out of the box. When it comes to Shermans, this component is fitted in this portion over here of the tank and has this distinctive angle to it, and it always seems to be having its lid pointed in the down direction. This bit of detailing is also found in the same location on M4A3 E8s as well. Another bit of detailing that is a very late fitting that is found on American tanks is that of the telephone box, which is found here on the rear corner. This component was another piece which was supplied by the Dragon kit and was mounted to the model. Now, on Shermans with the HVSS suspension, they would be found in this location right over here, directly next to the flip-up folding rack. Moving up from the telephone box takes us to the taillights and the taillight brush guards. These units here are the ones that were supplied with the kit, like I mentioned with the headlights. They are molded in clear plastic and receive the same type of procedure with that of the paint removal. However, when it comes to the brush guards are the photo etch ones which were supplied with the kit, but one mod was needed to be made to the photo etch. For some reason, the Dragon photo etch piece is comprised out of two components, which is very nicely done. However, the rib that is on the back end of the brush guard on the Dragon kit is designed to stand up and is like a vertical blade. This is incorrect. On the real Sherman tanks, the piece was horizontally mounted and was simply bent in the center and then went its way down to the hull. On the model here, I did not utilize the Dragon blade piece. Instead, on the same fret of photo etch, I took one of the sprues, which was left over from the fenders, as it was the correct size and shape, simply bent it and added it in its place. This greatly helps the accuracy of the piece compared to utilizing the kit photo etch components. Moving from the taillight takes us to the stave and ranging pole detailing. Now, this is one portion of the 105mm Shermans, which makes it stand out from the other variants of the Sherman that are in the Sherman family tree. Because of the 105mm gun, the tank did have two extra cleaning staves, which were located in this section here. The other staves are still located on the under portion of the flip-up grille, which is standard for most Sherman tanks. The two extra poles for the staves were mounted on this elaborate bracket system, which is found here on the rear portion of the tank. Now, in addition to the staves, directly below them is a mount for that of ranging poles. These would be utilized for the tank when it's being used for indirect fire. The ranging poles themselves have this red and white coloring to them, and the real ones had spikes on them which allowed them to be stuck into the ground. When not in use, they would be stowed in this rack system that we have here. Now, as a quick side note, if anyone wants to know more information about this and how it actually functions and works, I describe this in much more detail in my 1/6 scale M4A3 105 Sherman build video. As for the model here, the staves and the bracket are stock with the Dragon kit and were a nice touch. However, the ranging poles were absent. The ranging poles that you see on this model here are fabricated out of lengths of wire, which were painted to replicate that of the ranging poles, and then mounted just before the addition of the staves, which go directly on top. This bit of detailing here is definitely required and makes the model really stand out, as opposed to not having the ranging pole detailing present. Moving from the cleaning rods and the staves takes us to the rest of the detail layout on the rear, which is standard M4A3. Now, like I said before, I deleted the molded-in handles for that of the rear engine hatch, as well as the engine grills themselves, and replaced them with small metal wire. This greatly helps compared to leaving the molded ones left in place. While on the back, I also went ahead and drilled out the small little drainage holes, which are found on the bullet splash rims found for the fuel caps, as well as the turret guard. This is commonly done on my smaller scale Sherman builds, as it greatly helps the detail accuracy of the piece. Also, as for the weathering, you'll notice that for the ones that handle fuel, I went ahead and added more of a grime type weathering compared to the one in the center, which is that for water, which would be used that for that of the radiator. While still on the rear engine deck, one mod that also has to be done is that of the deletion of the grouser cover cap storage areas. These are integrally casted into the top deck, as on the Dragon Sherman kit, this runner here is recycled and is used on several of their Sherman variants, including that of their late M4A2. The M4A2 does have these sections present, however not this version of the M4A3 with this pattern of front angle. These sections here absolutely have to be deleted for not only accuracy reasons, but for just fitting of the components as well. As if you leave them, the integral molded pieces in place, you're going to have difficulty in fitting some of the parts. The pieces are deleted with that of some sandpaper as well as a Dremel. Now, a lot of care needs to be exhibited in removal of these pieces, as you can easily over remove, which will then leave divots into the hull, which will then require body work to make it nice and flush again. So this is an area which really needs to be exhibited by care by the builder. Another interesting feature that has to be done by the builder is that all of the tool posts that you see on this kit here were not pre-drilled into the kit on the moldings. Instead, the kit does supply you with the indentations on the underside of where the tools go, and with a Dremel, with a small Dremel bit, you go ahead and drill out these locations. This is all illustrated pretty well with the instruction sheets, and was done with not a whole lot of effort. If a Dremel is not present, a pin vise can also be used for this exact same application, but it is something, namely for that of a more beginner or novice builder, where they will have a little bit of difficulty in dealing with. Moving our way to the bow hatch area, the hatch well itself was modified to having that of its cast texturing, as there was no cast texturing found on the kit supply component. On the real Sherman, this entire rectangular shaped object was one cast unit that had all of its hatch well and blower mounting equipment already pre-integrally casted. As for the bow hatches, these are the kit original, and what's unique about them is that they do have their periscope detailing. The periscope detailing is molded in the clear plastic, which was mentioned before, and once added does make the model a lot more improved compared to just having the pieces modeled flat, which is typically found on most 1/35 scale kits. As for the hatch, the handles were modified to having their stock ones deleted with metal ones added in place. Now you can also see the brush guards that are added were that of the plastic ones. The kit does supply you with metal brush guards via photo etch. However, for this build here, it was simpler for me just to utilize the plastic ones, and the metal ones will simply be saved for another build down the road. Moving our way up to the tank's turret, the turret that you see here is the kit original turret and was nicely detailed from the kit. It is definitely that of a Sherman with the 105 due to the fact that it has its secondary blower, which is found on the bustle, which is absolutely required in order to have the tank be that for a 105mm gun. Now, one thing to point out is that on the Dragon turret, there can be some mistakes and confusion made with that of the center detailing, which is found here. On the Dragon kit, they have some fittings which were present from one of their earlier Sherman releases, which was that of the 50 caliber barrel clamp and its details, which would have been mounted in the center portion of the turret, which is found on some other versions of the Sherman. However, for the 105, that's not correct. Because of the rear blower, the 105 has to have a special Shorty Pintle mount, which is located on this riser, which overhangs that of the blower. This is correct for the 105 Sherman. Because it is detailing here, you cannot have the barrel clamps located in this section here. Because on this variant of the Sherman, the barrel clamps would have been located on the rear bustle of the turret. You have here the mounting pintle for that of the cradle and the receiver. This clamp mechanism here clamps onto the vented portion of the M2, and then the barrel would be connected to these two little overhanging arms, and everything would be stowed centrally. In its place, there is a folding travel lock for that of the M2 once fitted. Now, the travel lock detailing is kit supplied, however, the kit is absent the actual mount for the travel lock itself. I believe this travel lock, if I can remember, was for that of the split hatch Commander's Cupola, which is also supplied with the kit and is a carryover from another Sherman kit. In fact, it's not supposed to be even utilized on this build. The real Sherman did have the travel lock, and it was found in the center portion. To add it, I simply used the Dragon piece that was from the split hatch Cupola, but I fabricated the actual mount itself. The actual mount was fabricated out of two pieces of Plastruck stock, which was cut to the shape of that of the travel lock mount. Once everything was added and mounted, it helps the look of the component as opposed to leaving it mountless. Moving from the travel lock takes us to the smoke grenade launcher. The launcher is found on Sherman tank turrets, and on this kit here, it is a simple hole that is integrally molded into the turret casing. To improve the look, I took a small little piece of shrink tubing and simply glued it into the hole that is found on the kit. By leaving a little bit emerging from the turret surface, this helps the look of the piece as opposed to just leaving it stock. Moving away from the grenade launcher takes us to the Searchlight position. Now, this model does have the ability to have the Searchlight in its deployed state. However, while I was working on the piece, the small little frail handle that's utilized to hold up the Searchlight was broken and was unusable. Rather than trying to fabricate a new one, I simply just made this tank representing that with the Searchlight in its stowed state inside the vehicle. To do this, you simply take the kit supplied cover cap and you mount it on top of the portion which the Searchlight would actually plug into. Moving from the Searchlight takes us to the Vane Sight. The Vane Sight is also kit supplied, however, needs to have been modified from its kit original as it had difficulty in fitting onto the actual kit turret. What I went ahead and did was I went ahead and deleted the stock mounts and fabricated a new mount out of a flattened piece of wire. The wire was flattened, bent to the shape of the real one, and then mounted to the turret. Once mounted, the Dragon piece was simply mounted on top, thus completing the detailing. Moving our way to the MP48 spring antenna base, this is the kit supplied unit and was simply utilized. Now, just like all MP48s, the center portion, which would be that of the ceramic insulator, was painted to resemble that of the amber color. On the bottom portion, the kit is absent its bottom base portion for the antenna base, and a new one was simply made from a piece of shrink tubing. Now, if you notice, no exposed or external antenna has been added due to the really minute size of the molded Dragon piece. Trying to drill this out to put a wire in would be a fool's errand, so I simply left it antenna-less, and the antenna on the real ones would also be removable as well. As for the antenna well, just like on all of my Sherman builds, I drilled out the small little drainage hole, which would be present here. And there's also another small hole, which would be found on what would be a secondary antenna base, which is normally not utilized on most Sherman tanks. As for the Shorty pintle mount, like I said before, this is a special piece specifically for the Sherman with the 105. Now, on this Dragon kit here, the M2HB is not supplied with the kit. And rather than trying to drill this out in order to mount on another machine gun, I simply left it stock with that of its rain cover cap painted in place. Like I said before, the cover cap is actually integrally molded to the Dragon piece, and to make it shine, I went ahead and painted it with that of gloss black. The real one was a rubber cup and was used exactly for this purpose. Now, in the center portion, there would be a little metal eyelet, and this would connect with a chain to that of the back portion here of the pintle mount. Now, on 1/35 scale, that's almost impossible to properly replicate, so what I simply did was I took a little brush of olive drab paint and painted the center portion, which gives the illusion of the eyelet with that of its metal washer, which would be found in the center unit as well. Moving our way to the Commander's Cupola, one nice bit of detailing that is found with the Dragon kit is that of the periscopes are molded in clear plastic, which is another nice little addition found on these versions of this Sherman kit from Dragon. One thing to point out is that this plastic is very brittle and can easily crack if using a standard X-Acto to try to remove the pieces. So a lot of care must be exhibited by the builder in order to get these pieces installed in one piece. Moving our way to the gun and the mantlet. Starting with the mantlet, all these fittings here are stock Dragon. This includes the mantlet, the lift hooks, as well as even the tarpaulin mounts. All this is stock DML and was simply used as is. Now, as for the barrel itself, the barrel is the stock unit. However, the Dragon kit does give you an option. You can either go with a one-piece plastic barrel, or you can go with a turned aluminum barrel. For this model here, I went with the aluminum barrel, and the stock barrel went into the spare bin. Now, the stock barrel is not useless, and will more than likely end up on another 105 Sherman build that may come down the road. Now, even though this vehicle here is primarily intended for support, it still does utilize that of a coaxial M1919 machine gun. Just like with all Sherman tanks, the 1919 is located on this section here of the mantlet. As you can see on this model here, I went ahead and weathered it accordingly. Moving our way to the model's paintwork, the model is painted in a late war ETO camouflage scheme. Camouflage patterns like this would be present on vehicles from around September of 1944 all the way up to the end of the war in 1945. The camouflage pattern consisted of black bands which would have been spray gunned over the base olive drab that the tanks would have been shipped and supplied with. And because this vehicle here is a very late pattern of Sherman, building it with this camouflage pattern is definitely appropriate. As for the model's markings, these were the kit supplied decals, and the decals went on very effortlessly and are good quality. The decal sheet does supply with several different options to mark the model to represent it for a number of different units. As for skill level and recommendation, I definitely do not recommend this kit here for a beginner model builder. An intermediate builder will also have some difficulty in putting one of these kits together. This is due for the fact that this model does have a lot of finely molded plastic components. These plastic parts are very frail and are easily bent, broken, and lost. In addition to the plastic components, this model does feature the use of photo etch pieces. These photo etch components are definitely another area where a intermediate builder may have difficulties in getting everything properly bent to shape, as special tooling is required in order to facilitate this procedure. Furthermore, the amount of hand fitting that I encountered to get the hulls to fit properly is another area where an intermediate builder may or may not have a little bit of difficulty. This model here is definitely best recommended for someone who is an advanced builder. This kit here I recommend for anyone who's a fan of World War II armor, as well as American armor in general. Not to mention all of the Shermanaholics out there, like yours truly. This version of the Sherman is a unique specimen, and like I said before, is one that it was overlooked with the other versions of the 105mm Sherman that have been released in plastic from other makers. And it was a nice variation that Dragon chose to model in 1/35 scale. For me, it feels good to finally get to this build and get it out of the way, as this particular tank has been sitting in the stash for many years. And now that it's finished, it's great to have it off my to-do list. And with that, that concludes this model showcase video for this 1/35 scale US World War II M4A3 105 HVSS Sherman tank. If you like this video, stop by and like us on Facebook, where there are more photographs of this build that have been posted, as well as many of the other builds that are found on the ECA channel. In addition to that, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail upgrades. Thanks for watching.